My mother, Gretta Jean Wong, was born on July 31st, 1921 in London, Ontario. My mother has had a very long and full life. She is proud to be a Chinese Canadian. She has tried throughout her life to help promote equality for all members of her community. It was difficult for her. She faced discrimination as an Asian and as a female. Her life and her journey are best understood with a brief history of Chinese Canadian immigration.
It all starts in 1858 with the first major migration of Chinese people to Canada. Many Chinese people were choosing to leave for Canada in the hopes of more opportunities and a better living for themselves and new generations to come. This happened when China was experiencing a disintegration of their economy. For many, the move to Canada made perfect sense. Many Chinese people immigrated in these early years for the gold rush, and later for the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. To their surprise, they were not welcomed with open arms. Instead, they faced extreme systemic discrimination and exclusion by Canadians. After the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885, the government imposed a drastic anti-Chinese legislation which mandated a head tax of $50 for all Chinese immigrants. Gretta's father, Lem Wong, immigrated to Vancouver in 1896 with his uncle at the young age of 15. They would have to pay the expensive head tax to enter the country. In 1900, the Chinese immigrant head tax was doubled to $100 per person, and 3 years later, the head tax was raised to an appalling $500. At this time, Lem was working tirelessly, moving province to province, until he finally earned enough money to settle in London, Ontario. Lem was now ready to start a family, but with so few Chinese women in Canada and with intermarriage between races not considered acceptable, he went back to China to find his wife, Toy Chen. After he got married, Lem went back to Canada, and in 1907, his wife gave birth to their first son in China. Lem returned alone, leaving his wife in China because he could not afford to pay the head tax. During this time, racial violence was rampant in Canada, culminating with the horrible Vancouver riot. Mobs were attacking Chinese business owners throughout the country, making life very unsafe for Chinese Canadians. In 1911, he also established himself as a business owner to meet the requirement of Canadian immigration laws as they applied to Chinese immigrants, to bring his wife and son to Canada. Together, they had 7 more children, Gretta being the second youngest of them all.
My mother's life was greatly affected by the Depression and World War II. This was an extremely difficult time for all Canadians. Her parents worked tirelessly to support the family. My grandmother primarily raised the children, but she also worked many odd jobs, while my grandfather worked day and night to make his restaurant a success. My grandfather's restaurant was special. He delivered a level of quality above the other restaurants in the area. He was proud to be considered the owner of the most elegant restaurant in London. My mother believes her family's acceptance into the community was due to her father's hard work and her siblings' involvement with local sports teams. My grandfather even went as far as to join all of the political parties in Ontario because he did not want to insult anyone. My mother and her siblings were encouraged by their father to attend church and to partake in the London community as much as possible. They all experienced some racist name-calling, and at times they were not invited to some social activities. But compared to many other places across the country, London was quite accepting towards their family. They were not seen as a risk because of their low numbers. They were accepted into the London community as they were the only Chinese family. I remember her talking about one of her sisters in the early 1940s being denied entrance into a dance hall. Her sister stood strong with pride and claimed, "I am one of the Wongs of London. Why can't I come in?" I think this really shows how strong they were. Their beliefs on equality had been given a strong foundation by their father. My mother always said that her and her siblings' success was due to the hard work, emotional guidance, and the progressive thinking of both of her parents. Canada gave my grandparents the opportunity to be who they wanted to be. For example, my grandfather strongly disagreed with many practices back in China, including feet binding, which is something my grandmother was forced to do as a child. He encouraged all of his children to take advantage of all of the opportunities that were available to them in Canada. My mother was never afraid to fight for what she believed in or to do what was right. My mother and 6 of her siblings ended up attending university. Her siblings were all successful. 3 became doctors and another a biochemist. Education was very important to the whole family. My grandfather encouraged his daughters to create a pathway for themselves when there wasn't already one there. My mother's older siblings attending medical school was an inspiration. They subsequently helped partially pay for her education. My mother knew law was her calling in life. She remembered being an argumentative person. Her family always commented she should be a lawyer.
Gretta was inspired by the importance of law while watching a local lawyer defend the Wong family from restrictive laws that controlled the family and impacted their business. Chinese Canadians were struggling across the country with racism enforced by the government. This strongly limited their ability to succeed and feel welcome in their new home.
In 1943, my mother was accepted as a law student at the Law Society of Upper Canada. There were no Chinese lawyers in the country at this time, and there were very few women in law. On top of this, she was the first Chinese woman to study law in the country. My mother didn't know this when she enrolled at Osgoode Hall. She did what inspired her. She took advantage of the opportunities that were there. She moved to Toronto and immediately noticed there was more racism. She would even experience refusal to rent an apartment simply because of her Asian name. She realized that being a minority would make it extremely difficult to find a firm willing to offer her an articling placement. Luckily, 2 of her brothers had previously worked at Leighton McCarthy's summer residence in Muskoka because of their father's reputation in the restaurant industry. Leighton McCarthy's law firm was one of the biggest firms in the city at the time. After my mother came to visit, he subsequently offered her a placement in his firm. In 1943, she officially began her articles at the McCarthy & McCarthy Law Firm. Leighton McCarthy's support from the top of the firm stopped any racist discrimination impeding her growth. She would face the most issues with sexism, as the men believed the women should deal with the more trivial matters. There were only 3 other women in the firm.
Gretta's first year at the firm was mostly filled with errands for others, and she did not make enough money to live. In the 3 years she was articling, she never even met a client. In her 3rd year, they only provided her with the ability to research simple estate matters, never any in-person court visits. Around this time, Gretta would become active with the Women's Law Association of Ontario, a group that supported women lawyers. While in the WLAO, Gretta was lucky to be surrounded by influential women such as Margaret Hindman, a leading advocate for women's rights, as well as Helen Kinnear, Canada's first female Superior Court judge. While in law school, Gretta also banded together with other female classmates and created the Osgoode Women's Legal Society. The Owls got together monthly to talk about how they could help each other. Their group became one of the first to fight against any acts they felt were discriminatory against females.
The Owls began their first major protest over the moot court program. When the law students went to do a mock trial, the women learned they were not allowed to be involved because women were prohibited from serving on juries in Ontario. Their group was furious by this unfair and unjust law. When their informal protest did nothing, they decided to picket and make sure they were heard. The group stood around Osgoode Hall with signs to illustrate their strong points of view. After causing the necessary attention on the issue at hand, a decision was made to halt the program. 1 year later, the Owls took their attention to the stipulation that the president representative elected for the Student Legal Society must be male. Women were only allowed to participate as a secretary. They confronted the situation once more, and their actions caused the male students to cave and change the bylaw. Funny enough, they ended up nominating a man for the position, but it was all a matter of principle. The best candidate should have won, not a specific gender. Those same male students were always pushing for women to be more feminine. The press was currently covering sexism towards Clara Brett Martin, the first female lawyer in Canada. They would continue to announce that she was not changing to a more masculine look.
Let's step back and take a look at the first Chinese-Canadian lawyer, Koo Dak Yip. He was born in Vancouver and raised in a more Chinese segregated lifestyle. He wanted to study law, but was prohibited from doing so in his home province, so he decided to go to Osgoode Hall in Toronto in 1941. Although the Law Society accepted him, his classmates were not nearly as accepting. Koo was surprised when he received racial ridicule from classmates. Koo also struggled to find a firm to article with. Luckily, his brother-in-law connected him with a lawyer who subsequently offered him an articling position at his firm. When Koo Dak Yip's name was called to the bar in 1945, he became the first Asian lawyer in Canada.
One year later, my mother was called to the bar as the first Chinese-Canadian woman. My mother was later told this accomplishment meant a lot for the future of Chinese Canadians who wanted equal opportunities. The end of the war signaled change by Canadian legislators, and it became a criminal offense to affect the employment and education because of racial discrimination. My mother later studied clinical psychology at the University of Toronto. She worked at the Andrew Mercer Reformatory for Women during this time. My mother enjoyed this work, but it also exposed her to the discrimination that other groups faced. She tried to help any woman she could, but there was extreme resistance in the institution. On December 9, 1950, my mother and father, Alan Grant, were married. My mother's marriage to a non-Chinese husband had defied many of the norms at the time. Despite not being in active practice, she remained a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada. To stay involved in the law, my mother helped my father on a part-time basis. He encouraged her to get back into practice and suggested that she apply to be the Assistant City Solicitor for the City of London. After 3 years on the job, she joined my father's practice to form Grant & Grant.
Gretta's next step was to join a handful of women lawyers who were in London to help form the Middlesex Women's Law Association. Over time, as more lawyers joined the practice, it evolved into a successful and wide-reaching organization which acted as a support network for women lawyers. When a legal aid position opened up in 1967, Alan encouraged Gretta to apply, and she was given the job soon after. Gretta found it very important to make a point of helping minorities in need. She was credited with making the legal aid system more accessible to communities that were not as familiar with the law.
My mother was surprised when she was made a QC in 1969, the same year she sold her practice. In 1981, she achieved another first. She would become the first female president of the Middlesex Law Association. Unfortunately, in province-wide meetings held in Toronto, she still felt that men were not giving equal opportunity for female voices to be heard. In 1988, at the age of 67, my mother retired from legal aid. My mother was always helping where she could. My mother's family was among many other inspirational Chinese Canadians who helped shape what this country is today. Their actions and reputation contributed to ensuring Canada's freedoms are available to all of its citizens. These contributions helped make Canada one of the most multicultural countries in the world. Chinese Canadians have fought valiantly, facing adversity to be viewed as equals in Canada. The ongoing discrimination still exists in this country, and there is work left to be done.
On behalf of the people and government of Canada, we offer a full apology to Chinese Canadians for the head tax and express our deepest sorrow for the subsequent exclusion of Chinese immigrants. Thank you.
There are still many other hurdles to be overcome by the present generation. I hope my mother's story gives people inspiration, as it does for me. I'm proud to call her my mother.